Well, hello there, everyone. We are back for another Malazan discussion. In this case, we are talking about a novel of the Malazan Empire, specifically Blood and Bone. And I am joined here. Do you have your copy there, AP? Yes, okay.
Yep.
There it is. There it is. Beautiful. And of course, I am joined as usual by my partner in crime, Dr. A.P. Canavan, to discuss today in a very non-spoiler way this wonderful book. So AP, how are you?
I'm clearly very, very professional and remembered to put that up before we started recording.
That was very subtle, the way you, and then, very subtle.
See, This is what happens when I have basically not been doing this for a while. I had, was doing one video now and again.
One vacation and you fall apart. One vacation, huh?
Try to get back into the swing of things, and it's all gone to hell.
Oh, dear. Well, the important thing is you're here, and we are going to pick your brain in a non-spoiler way, because this is our non-spoiler discussion. Our spoiler talk on Blood and Bone will be on AP's channel, A Critical Dragon, which if for some reason you haven't seen his channel, please check it out. Subscribe. It is absolutely amazing, full of very, very wonderful content and incredible insights about writing and storytelling and narrative and all that. So,
and highly professional placement of books.
Very professional. So let's talk about Blood and Bone, which is the fifth book in Novels of the Malazan Empire. And I want to start by talking about some of the themes. And I think the very obvious place to start, AP, and I would like you to begin to discuss this, would be colonialism / imperialism. So this is a very, very, I mean, it's a Malazan theme, I think it's fair to say. But I would, if you were to ask me which book among all the Malazan books puts this theme forth most directly, I would have to say Blood and Bone. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. No, it's interesting because when we have looked at the novels of the Malazan Empire, there's always been a core central sort of premise that Esslemont has been exploring. We saw like the horror elements in Knight of Knives, religion in Stonewielder, the past and the present and tradition in Orb Scepter Throne. But with Blood and Bone, so much of this is about that almost, now it's framed slightly differently than this, but the easiest way to understand it is sort of the European colonial attitude going into the barbaric sort of jungle lands and bringing that attitude. It's that almost Eurocentric colonial attitude. And that's what gets explored and broken down and played with in so many of the different threads. It is so central to everything here. And Esslemont, when he was doing his PhD, was looking at a lot of travel writing, particularly, I think it was 19th century travel writing?
It says 19th century in here, yeah, in the acknowledgements, yeah.
And you can see a lot of that attitude, that's the frame for this. So the setting here is essentially jungle setting.
Yeah.
And it's these travel logs running through the jungle and the different attitudes being expressed by the people on these journeys. And the first thing to pick out about this is jungle is a very difficult setting to evoke. And when you think of sort of like a classic jungle story like Tarzan, Tarzan doesn't really feel particularly authentic when you read about the jungle. It's very much someone who has heard of the jungle, has gone for a walk in the local well-maintained forest park and gone, yes, this is the same.
Yeah.
But we know from Esslemont's experience that he lived in
Thailand.
Which country?
He lived in Thailand. Yeah.
He was in Thailand, and I think he was in Japan as well. But
yeah,
when he was in Thailand,
he lived in both. But the jungle part, I think, is more Thailand. Yeah.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
But when he was in Thailand, I'm fairly sure I remember this right, but he did some exploring. And also, as an archaeologist, he spent some time in South American or Central American rainforest as well.
Okay.
So he's brought a lot of that very authentic knowledge to the creation of this setting. And it is one of the most powerful evocations of jungle as a setting that I've come across, because it is at once really, really well described and lived in, and you get a real sense of it. But at the same time, he captures the alien feeling of jungle for people like me, who, again, much like someone who wants to write about jungle, I'd go to my local forest park and go, yeah, it's kind of like this.
Yeah. Well, I'm more of a woodsman myself, but so yeah, no. And I think one of the things that he does so effectively in Blood and Bone is he really uses the epigraphs to get across these themes of colonialism, imperialism, and this sense of this outsider invading and coming into the space and feeling superior about it the whole time, of course, bringing civilization to the barbarians and all of that. But he's epigraphs, I've never seen in a Malazan book, the epigraphs so unified in that way. Because I think if you look closely at the epigraphs in Blood and Bone, you really do see this theme being hit on very effectively. Right from the beginning to end, I think every epigraph was sort of reinforcing this smugness, this arrogance of the outsider coming in and assuming that they're there to tame and to civilize and all of this.
And there's also a narrative running through it as well, because it keeps coming back to the same expedition.
Yep.
But what's interesting is those epigraphs, on the one hand, explore that aspect of the sort of smug, civilized colonial power, that attitude, but at the same time are set in direct opposition to what we are seeing people actually experience. And so it's almost like the epigraphs run counter to what the narrative thrust is. So it's having these juxtaposed narratives running against each other, and it's through that contrast that you get to see it in sharp relief.
Yeah, imagine a Malazan author questioning the authenticity of history. My goodness. But speaking of questioning the authenticity of history, there's also a strong sense of futility in this effort to colonize and conquer. And it's very interesting. We'll talk about some of the inspirations, I think, or connections in literature that are fairly evident, I think. For example, Heart of Darkness being one, but we'll get to that point in a bit. But this sense of futility of the jungle being something much bigger, and the human assumption that we are not only separate from nature, but superior to it, is something that once in a while, nature just sort of squishes us and puts us in our place. And this is a great example of the vastness of this jungle in contrast to these little, insects coming in there thinking that they rule everything, So I thought that was brilliantly done.
And also the idea that the humans see the jungle as an enemy, as this thing that needs to be put in its place.
The monster, yeah.
And everything then that they see in the jungle is given that lens of monstrosity. And we've talked about this before, about othering through a demonization of viewing physical differences as a thing that relates to morality, this physical manifestation of an internal purity almost. And the lie of that's clearly not true. And that's something that runs through this. People who are perceived as barbaric because they don't live up to the norm of the character. People who are physically different because they are of a different race, a different, and by like we're talking fantasy races here.
Very different.
That again, they are perceived as animalistic. They are perceived as less than human. They are perceived as monsters who need to be destroyed. And yet it is clear they are people. And it's this superficial judgment based on someone's looks And clearly, like as a reader, like you initially identify with the position of these characters going into the jungle. It is a frightening place.
Yeah.
And one of the big strengths of this novel is how Esslemont slowly brings us round to show us the error that we would be making in those assumptions. And it's not again wagging of the finger in your face going, you shouldn't do that, that's bad.
Right.
It's illustrating the problems with that attitude and allowing the reader to come to terms with it.
Yeah.
So it's actually it's a real strength of it, and it's something that I quite enjoy. It's not in your face about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And speaking of seeing oneself in the other, this book takes some interesting, I think, philosophical turns at times that I really enjoyed. It reminded me a little bit of philosophical Buddhism at times, the idea of seeing one's identity and looking at this epiphany of one's connection to the people around one, but also to life all around one in the form of this vast jungle, in the form of the cosmos. So the individual's relationship to the cosmos is something that it doesn't hit you over the head with it, but there are certain passages that do get a little philosophical in a way that I really enjoyed. Particularly, it's appropriate to one of the characters, which we'll talk about when we do the spoilers. But there's this one passage I want to read that sort of gets across what I'm trying to talk about here. It's on page 493, and it goes, "Your identity isn't you. The you know," the first you there is in italics. So the you know is merely an accretion surrounding an empowering kernel of awareness. It aggregates slowly until it achieves self-identity, the differentiation between self and other. Each aggregation is unique, of course. It happens in an infinity of ways, creating everyone. Each identity is but the mask upon awareness. I love that sentence. Identity is the mask upon awareness. It's brilliant stuff. It's a lot of fun. And of course, I'm taking it out of the story here, but it's such a wonderful moment in the story when this occurs, which we'll talk about later. But he really does an effective job. This is a Malazan theme. This is a theme that we get all the time in Erikson's books and in the other books by Esslemont. But I love the way this iteration of it. I love the way he's put it here.
Yeah, and again, it's the fact that like a lot of the other Malazan works that we've looked at, it's not necessarily each of these different plot threads is linked through narrative events. Sometimes it is these thematic explorations, or the casting light on a thematic exploration, where that particular thread is from, is one that is very much almost like a keystone to talking about one of the themes that's running through, that it is used as a way to help the reader understand what it is that Esslemont is exploring. Because we've heard this criticism of the Malazan books, both Erikson and Esslemont, that they're obtuse at times. They don't tell you things up front at times. And here, Esslemont's actually devoted an entire thread to showing you the very thing that he wanted to explore in that aspect of philosophical spirituality. Yeah,
this added a layer for me of depth to my understanding of Erikson's series of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. A lot of things fell into place for me as I was reading Blood and Bone, and things that I sort of knew, but I've got a new sort of take on them, if you will. And we can talk about that when we do the spoilers as well. But I really appreciated that. I love the view that I got, which is a little bit different. And it's important to mention that this book is happening near the end of the Malazan Book of the Fallen as well. So,
and that was the point I was about to make, is we really have read these anyone reading along, don't read them in the order that we've read them.
Don't do what we do. Yeah.
If you're trying to match up how the events pair up, because we're slightly out of sync.
A little bit.
Because this really is occurring almost like sort of concurrently with the crippled god.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where this falls in.
Yeah.
So you can read it after the crippled god.
You could, yeah, and then assail last, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. But in saying that, I don't think you lose out too much, because it doesn't spoil the ending of the crippled god.
No.
It is its own thing. But knowing what happens in the crippled god and reading this, again, it adds to the experience. So it's not that you need the crippled god to read this book, or you need this book in order to understand the crippled god. They build on each other. They are in conversation and in dialogue with one another. And it's a great beauty of the writing between Erikson and Esslemont, that they take from each other. Their books are in conversation with one another, and they build on what the other one has done. And it's not that you need the others in order to understand it. It just adds to the conversation.
Yeah. Speaking of that sort of dialogue that emerges from a close relationship, there's some wonderful moments of friendship in this book. There's a particular pairing in here. It's a Malazan duo that I really enjoyed. One of my favorite duos now in the Malazan world, and I just met them in this book. But yeah, they're a wonderful pair. We'll talk about in the spoilers. But along with the friendship, I think it's that two-sided thing again, that other, and then recognizing oneself in the other. You have a lot in here about enmity, and vengeance is a big theme running through here as well, and what vengeance means and what it comes to mean after it is obtained. It's not always what you think it's going to be, right? So there's a lot in here about vengeance as well,
and it's linked to self-awareness, because that's the other thing that, with your quotation that got brought up, a lot of that has to do with self-awareness. And you can see a lot of the sort of the superficial actions that people are taking, and it's only through introspection and knowing oneself that they usually have almost like a Damascenian moment, where the scales are lifted from their eyes and they reevaluate who they are. They reevaluate what they are in light of these things. And again, I think that is a core moment in multiple threads in this, and it is a key aspect of it. It's not just it's convenient, it happened all these times. When you look at that companion thread that you quoted from, you see that this is a really important aspect of a lot of the character moments that we have.
Absolutely. I think a great illustration of that is the very last epilogue, which is where you get this notion of, it's a little bit different from the epigraph. I meant it is the epigraph to the epilogue, which is why I stumbled there. But it differs from the previous epigraphs in a very critical respect, and it's a slightly.
Can we call it an epilogograph?
An epilogograph. Thank you. That's exactly what we should be calling this this creature. So, but it really gets across what you were saying in that. It's a wonderful experience that many people have when you live abroad, or when you go to a place and you visit it, and it changes you, and it changes your perspective. And you see, as we were saying before, not just that you recognize the humanity in these other people, but you recognize your sameness in critical respects. And I love the way that Esslemont puts it in this epigraph to the epilogue. I'm just going to read this. And you'll see how it differs from the previous epigraphs, where it's much more of the arrogance shines through in the previous ones. Here, a lesson has been learned. So here we go. After having lived among these tribes for many years now, I have formed the considered opinion that, but for all the differing ritual accoutrements, myths, and attributes of their religious practices, we both seek answers to the same profound questions, universal to the human condition. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? So I love that. I mean, it just expresses so much in a fairly simple way, really. But it's also gets to the root of why we even tell stories, I think. So,
and you know, that is something we keep coming back to about literature, and it's what we keep coming back to about the conversations that we have, like on YouTube with our friends. That it's about shared experience and everyone having different perspectives, but coming together and learning from those perspectives.
Yeah.
People may have a different perception. People have different likes and dislikes. They have different preferences. But it's through discussing it and not getting annoyed, not going to, you're wrong and I'm right, but trying to see things from a different point of view.
Yeah.
And not only do you get to know that aspect better, that other point of view better,
Right.
you also get to know your own point of view better.
Exactly.
And that is the thing I think quite often we overlook, because we go, oh yeah, it's good to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. You can understand them better.
Yeah.
But you also understand yourself better. You understand your own position better when you've experienced something radically different.
Yep. Yeah, and that can often happen in the context of an individual's realization of something much bigger around them, and to which they might have viewed this thing as foreign, but then they realize their connection to it. And that's the individual lost in this vast jungle. And then seeing oneself as the jungle, as the enemy, as the foe, and making the transition to seeing oneself as, in fact, very much connected to the jungle, and recognizing one's sameness with the jungle, and kind of going with the flow. But this is something you see in a lot of other places. And, I was reminded as I started reading about this, what's the difference between a jungle and a forest, really? Is there really a meaningful difference? But I was reminded of Mirkwood while I was reading this, and the experience of Bilbo and the dwarves as they were going through this dark and foreign place, and feeling like they were trespassers, and feeling that there was a kind of a enmity surrounding them. But then, I think what you realize is there's great beauty there. There's great beauty to be seen if your eyes are open to it. There's great wonder. And there is the sense of this vastness, you being part of it, in fact, you being part of this wave of trees. So it's really cool. I love that. But it's an interesting thing, because you've got that simultaneous sense of wonder and awe with that sense of this foreignness, this threat, right?
Well, arresting strangeness, or
yeah,
and through the arresting strangeness, through challenging of assumptions about what is normal, you actually get insight into your own perceptual bias and preconceptions and assumptions. And I think that, again, it comes down to a lot of the storylines. When we see aspects of it, it's a lot about personal bias. And this, I hesitate to, these adventures through the jungle call that, those mistaken assumptions into question. And we see those that learn from it are rewarded.
Yeah. Those
that refuse to learn from it are not necessarily rewarded. We're staying away from spoilers.
Yeah, we are. But there's the obvious comparison to Heart of Darkness or Apocalypse Now, which was based on Heart of Darkness. There's a thread in Blood and Bone that particularly reminds me of that. Of course, there's the boat narrative. There's we won't get into details on that, but there's a boat part here, which definitely reminds you of going further and further into this mysterious, vast entity that is somehow foreign and other and threatening and all of that. But the attitude of the people on the boat.
But also the idea of the further they get away from civilization, further they get away from the normal, the more dreamlike it becomes, the more abstract it becomes, the more separate it becomes. And when you're divorced from the mundane, when you're divorced from the petty realities of those things, then suddenly your perception of what is important and what isn't important, and how you frame things and how you make these judgments, it's a complete reevaluation. And so you are changed by the experience. And so when you go back, you're looking at it with very new eyes. Yeah.
Well, it also has this tendency to strip the veneer of civilization away from you and put you in a more primal state, in which you more easily recognize your connection to the world around you. The illusion that we are separate from and superior to nature is stripped away from us by that experience, which is, I think, a very important lesson, perhaps. So, yeah. So go camping, everyone, and get bitten by mosquitoes and all of that.
No, don't go camping. Mosquitoes are horrible.
Well, compared to what's in here, mosquitoes are absolutely fantastic. I mean, we could talk about the horror elements of this. I
No,
mean, my goodness.
hang on a sec. The reason you don't need to go camping, the reason you don't need to go to the jungle is this book exists. Just read the book.
Yeah.
That way, you don't have to spend any time in the jungle. You don't get eaten alive by insects, and you don't have like weird monsters coming to eat you.
Well, that's always a plus, not having weird monsters coming to eat me alive. I suppose when you put it that way. So, but the horror elements in here, I mean, Night of Knives was where I realized, oh, wow, Esslemont can do horror too. But I don't know if the horror elements in Blood and Bone might outdo even Night of Knives for me. I mean, there was some creepy stuff in here that I'm pretty sure I'm going to kind of try not to think about while I'm eating dinner, you know?
But if you like, Night of Knives had that, it was very self-contained, but it was very urban.
Yes.
And it had that sense of like the haunted Gothic.
Yeah.
Then there was the scene in Stonewielder.
Oh, reaching into
the chest, and you're just going, oh, like that sort of body horror was. This is the island of Dr. Moreau. It's Heart of Darkness. It's psychological. It's landscape. It's setting. It's atmosphere. It's creepy crawlies and weird animals and being what's the TV show, like Naked and Afraid or something, where you're just dumped down in the middle of nowhere. It's that kind of the vulnerability of that. All of the different aspects of horror come to the fore here. And it's trampling all over the boundaries that I prefer to think exist between my skin and the rest of the world, right? I mean, don't
yeah, I mean, there's some gross stuff in here. I mean, very effectively done. I mean, but we won't get into details here.
So again, don't go camping, just read the book. The worst you're going to get is a paper cut. That you can deal with.
Yeah, we can deal with paper cuts around here. We're used to those. We faced that peril many times. So
manfully.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, with that, I think we've done a pretty good non-spoiler job of discussing it, but I have a feeling you have something else you want to say.
Oh, how did you guess? Was it my amazing poker face?
I've learned to read your subtlest signs, AP.
Well, what I wanted to say, we've talked very much about theme, and I know we're keeping this sort of non-spoiler, but there are some amazing action sequences in this.
My God, yes. Yeah.
There are some brilliant sort of magical, sort of battle-y things, clever magical things in it. But there's some really, really good fight sequences, action sequences.
Yeah.
And it's exploring an aspect of the Malazan world that we hadn't really explored before. It had been mentioned before. We'd very briefly been on one of its beaches before.
Yes.
But this is a whole exploration of land and culture that had not cropped up in any of the other books. So there's a huge amount of what you would call Malazan lore here that is being explored.
Yes.
So that's one aspect. There are some brilliant fight sequences. We have aspects of plot threads that have been laid down in various books, running through this as core threads that are being developed and brought forward and pushed to the last novel, A Seal, that we'll be getting onto.
Oh yeah.
So it just to warn people, or well, not to warn people, but not to gloss over the sort of the plot stuff in it, the narrative events, the action, and the just spectacle of some really amazing invention that we see in Esslemont's writing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I feel like we're getting close to the culmination of the Crimson Guard narrative in the Malazan world, which Esslemont has handled brilliantly up till now. So I'm really looking forward to A Sail, where I assume it's going to come to its conclusion. Also, as you say, Jakuruku is the continent where we've only been visiting briefly before, but also Erickson goes there in a prologue in, I believe it's for Memories of Ice. We get a glimpse of Jakuruku in a very disheveled state, I think it's fair to say.
Well, it's the twin continents
Yeah.
that are next to each other.
Corel
So, and again,
and Jakuruku. Yeah.
and that plays into it as well. That prologue from Memories of Ice is enormously important here. But again, you don't need to have read Memories of Ice. You don't need to have read that prologue to gain an appreciation of what happens in this book. But it adds that additional layer. It adds a resonance, an extra note to it that makes it all that richer.
Absolutely. Yeah. So lots of, I think, really cool threads from the Malazan world that Esslemont is handling here, which makes this book a lot of fun. So,
and one last thing to add.
Okay.
One last thing. It's also quite funny in places.
Oh, the humor. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Because there are aspects of the sort of the Malazan banter that we've come to know. There are aspects. Now, it is not as prominent, but there are aspects of it. But there's also a very dry, almost acerbic humor in the relationship between a sort of master-servant pairing.
Yeah.
That runs all the way through. And it one of the things that I think both Esslemont does, as well as Erickson, they balance the darkness and they balance the very powerful and emotive aspects, and they balance it with humor. That it helps lighten the tone in certain moments, so it's not unrelenting. And it's something that we sometimes overlook. We go, oh yeah, there was a couple of funny lines, but it's how they're being used is actually important, that they are a counterpoint. And Esslemont, I think, does that very well. It's understated in this novel, and yet they seem to always come at the right moment.
Yeah. That particular relationship is very important to the colonialism and futility threads, I think, that we talked about earlier. So yeah, great point. So, well, thank you for mentioning those, because those are all actually very important things to talk about in the context of Blood and Bone. And now I think we have pretty much covered everything in a non-spoiler, not everything, but we've done a pretty good job of it. So we will do our best to cover as much as we can. When we do the spoilers, that video will be appearing once again on A Critical Dragon. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, AP, so much for this discussion. I've enjoyed myself thoroughly, as always.
Well, thank you, Philip. And I'm so sorry for continually interrupting. And I go, one more point. It's like Columbo. Just one more thing.
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm glad you do, because you enrich these discussions so much by being you. So thank you. All right, everyone.
Thank you, Philip.
Take care until next time.